Hello! What happened to my card? There's all these pictures on it. Just kidding. We're not in the card today. We're actually in my daughter's room, who's a great artist. Um, so I thought, I mentioned it in yesterday's video. I thought that it would be helpful, and I think it's going to be helpful to kind of do a relatively short series of videos about some of these law of attraction, or some would say law of assumption concepts, and just look at them, in the way that I usually talk about them, which is this kind of like pragmatic, down to earth way. Um, we've been doing that with some of these recent Joseph Murphy videos, and obviously all of the Emile Coué stuff is down to earth. That's why it's so great, in my opinion. But I thought that today it would be interesting to just talk a little bit about Neville Goddard. Talk a little bit about Nev and this law of assumption thing. Because I think this is important to point out. I pointed it out before, but if you're new to this channel, you might not have heard of this. And that is that this whole idea that the law of assumption is somehow very different than most of these other, manifesting concepts, new thought concepts, law of attraction concepts that we hear about. The idea that the law of assumption is somehow very different than that, I think is way off base. I mean, I think that's ridiculous, quite honestly. I think that we have to get way beyond these terms and these quote unquote laws that we hear a lot about in order to appreciate this stuff more thoroughly. And I mention this somewhat often because I think it's so important. This scuttlebutt about how the law of assumption is different and better than the law of attraction, is really just not important and not relevant. Neville used that term. He used a lot of cool terms. Law of assumption, it's a great term. I love that. Like, just it sounds cool, right? But I wouldn't read too much into it. I know a ton of people are going to disagree with me. That's fine. But something I want to mention, and I think that this all ties into this series of videos we're going to do about the power of your subconscious mind, is this idea of assumption, right? And looking at it from Neville's point of view. Quite a few people have said, Neville, he was so articulate. He was so Shakespearean in his language, and he was much more seemingly dogmatic about assumption and imagination than certainly somebody like Emile Coué, but also somebody like Murphy. He was like an all or nothing guy, So there's this chapter in The Power of Awareness, which is, the law of assumption. Neville talks about that in The Power of Awareness, right? And that's just, I think, like the best example of it that I can think of off the top of my head. Chapter 3 is called Power of Assumption. And I think it's important to really look at what Neville is saying and see if it truly resonates with you. Because people say all this stuff about your imagination and assumption, and they say it so dramatically on places like YouTube. And I've always questioned that. I've always loved Neville. But from the first time I read him, I was like, well, I can really benefit from what he is saying in some way if I get even a little bit of this. And I have benefited a lot from getting a little bit of what he says. But I've also disagreed with so much of what he says. And I'm totally fine with that. And what people don't seem to understand a lot of the time when it comes to Neville's stuff is, if you are looking at this from a pragmatic viewpoint, you can disagree with some of the grandiose statements that Neville makes. Like the first line of this chapter of Power of Assumption is, man's chief delusion is his conviction that there are causes other than his own state of consciousness. So here, if you read into that, basically Neville is saying that it's delusional that anything is caused not by our consciousness. Um, I would just question that. I would really question that. From a pragmatic viewpoint, I think that he's making a very interesting and valuable point, an argument. But is that a truth? Is that an actual law? According to Neville, it is, I guess. But according to pretty much everybody else, it's not. And I really suggest you look at the video, or really the podcast episode. It's also on YouTube. The episode I did the other day about how you don't have to do anything. It's about UG Krishnamurti and about what I consider deep spirituality. I say in that episode, which again I strongly encourage you to listen to. I'll put a link above and below. I say in that episode that Neville is not a particularly deep spiritual teacher, in my opinion. I've never thought that. And so when he says stuff like, it's delusional to think that there's anything outside of your own state of consciousness, I think that's bullshit, personally. Because I've tested that and had experiences in my own life that just don't line up with that. What lines up for me is much more what I talk about in that episode, and what great, truly deep, mystical spiritual teachers like UG Krishnamurti, Byron Katie, Jan Fraser, Nisargadatta Maharaj, like the kind of stuff they're talking about, I'm like, wow, there is some truth to what they're saying. But this idea that your consciousness lines up and creates everything, again, it's great on a pragmatic level, but is it true in this deeper sense? You got to find it out for yourself. Maybe it is. Maybe it is for you. Maybe I'm full of shit. That's totally fine. But you got to think about it more critically than just thinking, well, this is a law, an actual law, and this is how everything works. If that law serves you, if that belief serves you, well, I guess it's a good belief to have. But if that belief doesn't serve you, and you realize that there's limitations to what consciousness does, and that, like Coué, he says, your imagination can affect things if it's at all natural. If it's at all natural. And Neville doesn't say that pretty much. He says anything is possible. And you could infer, at least in his early teachings, that he was saying, well, there's still laws of nature that we have to abide by. His later teachings, you don't necessarily have to infer that, and most people on YouTube and Reddit seem to not infer any of that. They think anything is possible. I can just do anything, even though I, am still, broke and living in my parents' basement. I can do anything, and there's this huge disconnect, So if it's at all natural line that Coué always said is very important, in my opinion. Because Coué says, there's more that's natural that we don't understand. There's more healing possible. There's more growth possible than we would expect. And it turns out it is natural, even though we might initially expect it to be unnatural. But there still is a limit to how much you can grow. And that's totally fine. Because your consciousness is not the end-all, be-all the way Neville makes it seem like, in my opinion. And again, listen to the podcast episode from the other day. Neville saying that your state of consciousness is the cause of everything. It's not necessarily like this deep spiritual truth. I mean, that's a very limiting concept, limiting belief, in my opinion. Reality, God, if you want to use that word, is much deeper and greater than something like that. This idea that you always have to use your mind, your consciousness, to improve your life and change and get better and better and attain liberation, that's all very limiting and selfish, in my opinion. I hear this line, like, all that befalls a man, all that is done by him, all that comes from him, happens as a result of his state of consciousness. Pragmatically, sure, what you think you have a tendency to become, right? I get that. But this idea that all that befalls you is because of your state of consciousness, the point of this video is just to have you question that. Question that. And maybe Neville's right. Maybe you agree with him. I don't agree with him. I never agreed with him. And I've gotten plenty of benefits out of his teaching, even though I don't agree with him on that one point. Um, but think for yourself. Test it out, as Neville would say. And this idea, back to what I was first talking about the law of assumption not being any different, what you're going to see in the videos that are coming up is that this idea of assumption is no different than these other manifesting concepts, new thought concepts, law of attraction concepts we hear so much about. We're going to go over some of these techniques that Joseph Murphy talks about in the power of your subconscious mind. And you're going to see that these techniques proceed in Neville. And even though Neville talked about assuming things so eloquently and so powerfully, people were doing the same thing before him. That should be pretty obvious, right? And it's not. It's not obvious enough to many people on YouTube. I can tell you that. Neville says in this chapter 2, you must be conscious of being healthy if you are to know what health is. You must be conscious of being secure if you are to know what security is. That makes sense on a pragmatic level. But if you're unconscious of it, does that mean you're not healthy? Does that mean you're not secure? These are just questions to ask. Again, I'm not trying to blast Neville here whatsoever. I'm just trying to look at what he's saying. And if you have Neville on a pedestal, which a lot of people do, have his teachings on a pedestal, you should figure out why. And if, even though you have Neville on a pedestal, you're not getting the results you want from his teachings, you want to ask yourself why that is and why you have him on such a high pedestal above every other manifesting teacher. Again, I love Neville's stuff, and it's so pragmatically valuable, but this absolute law type thing is not necessary. Look at this more like guidances, as opposed to laws. I think that'll be more fruitful for a lot of us. Yeah. I'm going to go into a lot of this with these techniques that Murphy talks about in the power of your subconscious mind. Everything I'm talking about will become more clear, probably. But Neville is not as original as many people expect. He was a great teacher, but he's not the only teacher talking about this stuff. And we're going to explore that even more to make that clear for all of us.